Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to be playing in my sketchbook and just having a little art chat with you. So my sketchbook is a Canson mixed media sketchbook. I painted the cover of mine, and I'm going to be using Gamsol today. Gamsol is just mineral spirits that are odorless, and I put it into that glass container you see so it's more accessible. And I'm going to be using colored pencils. I'm just showing you Prismacolor pencils, but I used a wide variety of colored pencils. I used Prismacolor and Derwent and Faber-Castell. I just used a variety of colored pencils I had on hand. And then I had two paintbrushes that I used, and that is to help blend the colored pencils with the mineral spirits. The picture I'm going to be drawing today is of this pink flower. I'm going to be focusing on the center flower and not focus as much on the background or blurred out flowers. This is a picture I got off of Pixabay if you are wanting to use it yourself. So I opened up my sketchbook and I taped the border just to help keep those edges nice and clean. And I just used masking tape for that. And then I started sketching out the basic shapes of the flower. I really encourage you to look at each individual petal and look at the actual shape of the petal instead of just drawing it out from what you guess the shape is, because odds are you'll be surprised at how they're actually shaped and formed. So I'm just looking at the reference photo and sketching out the basic shapes I see using a mechanical pencil. Mechanical pencils are my favorite sketching pencil. I really like the eraser that comes with them because most of them are pretty good. And then I like the fine point that they have, and so it's really easy to get those fine details in and just sketch your basic design. Just be careful not to push too hard because it can damage your paper and can affect how your later layers go on. So once I got the basic shapes of the petals blocked in and marked where the shadows and the highlights are going to be, then I started coming in with my color pencils, and I am working light to dark, and I am just using the side of my pencil to lightly build up the layers of color. I'm not pushing directly up and down because I don't want to indent or damage my paper. So I'm just keeping it on its side and just moving back and forth to put some pigment down. I'm using a variety of colors and looking at my reference photo to make sure I'm getting the tones and the values correct. Now, I'm not being too fussy with the layers I'm building up. I am just blocking in where the main colors go and the values and just making sure I'm not indenting my paper. The reason why I'm not being too precise or fussy with it is because it's going to be blended out using Gamsol. When you typically work in colored pencils, you're very cautious about how you build up your layers and how you blend your colored pencils on the paper. And so you have to be really careful about how you go about it. But since this is an early layer and it's going to be blended out with Gamsol, I don't have to be too finicky or fussy over it, which is what I really like. I just need to make sure I get enough pigment on there that the Gamsol can actually blend it out. So once I blocked in the basic colors and values of the flower, I took my Gamsol and I'm just dipping it into my brush into it, and I'm blending it out on the paper. It's almost a similar effect as using like a watercolor pencil where you color on your paper and then you activate it using water on your paintbrush. But instead of using a watercolor pencil, you're using traditional color pencils, and the Gamsol breaks down the wax and the binders that hold the pigments together. So when the Gamsol breaks down those binders, it allows it to spread and move on the paper. Gamsol, being mineral spirits, is something you typically use in oil painting. And over the last few years, it's become more and more popular to be used with colored pencils. Colored pencils have a tendency to fill up the tooth of the paper quickly, or if you damage the tooth of the paper and compress it down, it makes it so you can't apply any more layers to your picture. And so the benefit of using something like Gamsol is it allows you to build up those layers without filling up the tooth of the paper, and the Gamsol doesn't damage the tooth of the paper. So you get really soft blends, and it allows you to build your layers and get a lot more depth of color than what you can easily achieve with colored pencils. When I discovered the Gamsol technique, it actually was one of the ways that made me like colored pencils more. I discovered I liked using colored pencils in addition to pan pastels on sanded paper. And if I'm going to be working with more wax-based colored pencils, I like working with them with Gamsol. Colored pencils. And that's what I was doing with this picture. I wasn't feeling. After I had done another layer of colored pencil on the flower, I realized I needed to pull some of the colors that I'd used in the flower into the background to make it look more harmonious. Because the flower was standing out so much, it didn't look like it belonged in the environment it was in. It looked almost alien or like just kind of stuck in front. And so I needed to pull some of the colors that were in the flower into the environment around it to help it look more harmonious. If you're working on a picture and it looks like an object doesn't belong in the environment and it's kind of like floating in front of everything, there's a couple things that could be going on. You may not have enough value or shadow added to it to help it look like it belongs. Or you may have colors in it that aren't being reflected anywhere else. And so it's really important that you bounce those colors around, because the color something is kind of relative to its environment. We all know a basketball is orange, but if it's in a very cool, shadowy spot, it's not going to be this bright neon orange color. It's going to have more cool undertones. It might even look more brown and blue in areas. Versus if it's in the sunlight, it might almost have yellow tones to it because the sun and the way the light's hitting it is making it look brighter. So really look at your picture and see if you need to bounce some of those colors that are in it in other locations of your picture to help it look like it belongs. It's why some artists are really picky about whether they introduce a new color halfway through their. Something else to keep in mind is even though I added colors that were found in the flower into the background, I had those colors make sense. So I didn't pick the bright oranges. I didn't pick like the neon pinks that I had in the flower. I did the dark magentas and the violets and more of the cool toned red colors, or the more cool toned colors that were found in the flower, because I wanted that background to kind of still look like it's behind the flower, still look like it's almost in shadows. And so I chose the cool tones that were found in the flower for that background so that they wouldn't distract or compete with the flower. I hope that explanation made sense for you guys. Sometimes it's hard to explain what my brain is thinking in a way that makes sense for you. I don't always have the right words to explain my thought process. But thanks for hanging in there with me. So after I put in that background layer with colored pencils, I blended it out with Gamsol using the same technique as I used earlier. And I allowed that to dry, and then I started in with another layer of colored pencils. And it was about this point where I decided I really wanted to push the dark background. So instead of doing like a blue sky and have it really look like a summery day, I decided I wanted all the focus to be on that flower and just have the background just support the flower in the focus. So there's the texture of the plants and the leaves and the stems around the flower, but you don't really get much detail. And it's dark enough that your eye is instantly drawn to the flower. And so that's kind of the direction I ended up taking this sketch, is have the background support the focus of the flower and not be distracting at all. So you can see that I'm gradually building up more and more details, and I'm darkening the colors as I go. I'm bouncing back and forth between light and dark, but in general, the shadow areas are getting darker and darker as I work. That's because colored pencils are similar to watercolors in the sense of you want to keep your highlighted areas lighter, and you don't want to have to go over with too much of a white colored pencil. You can lighten things up that you might have made darker, but it can be really hard to bring it back to a full white. That's why you see so many like Instagram videos or YouTube videos where a white gel pen has been used to bring back highlights, or white ink or acrylic paints or gouache are added to it to bring back those bright white highlights. The problem is that is not very archival. So it's fine in your sketchbook because you don't need it to be light fast, and you're not worried about it if a piece of acrylic ink flakes off because it didn't bind to the wax. The problem is if you're doing a full piece that you want to have framed, if those bright highlights aren't archival, then they'll fade and it will look off after a few years. So if you're working a lot in colored pencil and you want to find a solution to bring back those bright white details and highlights, what I have found is something called touch-up texture, and you mix it with colored pencil titanium white. Those two things mix together, create almost like a paint, and you paint it on those white details onto your paper. I believe you can use colored pencil over the top of it if you need to tone down that bright white color. I haven't used it personally, but I've seen other artists use it with their colored pencil pieces. Lisa from the YouTube channel Lacree Fine Art uses this all the time in her colored pencil pieces, and she does absolutely stunning work. And if you want to find out more about this, I would suggest heading over to her channel where she does a full review and explains how it works and demonstrates it. Now we're getting to the point in the drawing where I'm looking a lot at my reference photo. Now I'm not trying to make this piece look hyper-realistic or photorealistic or anything like that. I just want it to look like a believable pink flower that you would see somewhere. But having a reference photo is so helpful for that. It gives me a guide on shadows and highlights. So even if you aren't going for hyperrealism, you just want it to look believable, I highly recommend using a reference photo. I know I talk about that all the time, but they're super helpful. Another thing I'm doing is I'm using a smaller paintbrush at this point for the areas that I'm blending using Gamsol. I'm not blending as much as I was before. I'm just blending small details, and I'm using a finer point paintbrush for this. The paintbrush shapes I was using are filbert paintbrushes, but I'm using the smaller one for these details because it's easier to do those details and not disturb other areas of the painting. I don't want to blend everything, just the small areas that I see need fine-tuning. Once I blended those areas, I allowed it to dry again, and then I came back in and started adding more and more layers of pencil. Now the paper I'm using works for pastel pencil, but it doesn't take a ton of layers. So at this point, my piece, the tooth of the paper is almost full and it can't take too many more layers or adjustments. So I'm having to be really careful with how I layer and where I'm layering so that I don't fill in the tooth of the paper and make it so I can't add any more layers to the piece. So now I'm just adding the finishing touches to this piece. This project was a really fun and quick warm-up to get me back in the swing of drawing. I hadn't really painted or drawn for almost a week and was kind of just feeling in a funk and not very creative. I was more tempted to just lay in bed and read a book than to draw. And so I changed things up. I just pulled out my sketchbook where I didn't feel pressured to draw anything perfect or make anything super realistic or appease any customers or anything like that. I could just be creative. And so that's what I did with this piece. And it got me warmed up and excited to draw. And after I did this, I started in on my bigger projects I have lined up. So if you're kind of feeling in a funk or you just don't know where to get started, pull out your sketchbook and have fun creatively for a little bit, and maybe that will help you. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I hope you do something creative with it. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. And if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you next time.